May 24, 2016. You wake up excited to hop onto this new game. The new class shooter that everyone's been talking about for the past few years. You log onto Battle.net, you've come prepared, and you've pre-installed the game so you can play it on release. You boot it up and are greeted to my god, it's beautiful. This is what we all wanted. Finally, a successor to the class shooter genre. Was it chaotic? Yep. But remember, this is back in the day when we're not limited by roles, or even heroes. Don't you have fond memories of going 6 Winstons and just zapping everyone's like the flies they were? Or how about the times you could swap out 3 DPS, 1 tank, 2 healers, if the enemy healers were a little too protected? Those were the good days. Some might call it rose-tinted goggles, but I digress. Overwatch was fun. And that's all that mattered. When rank came out, it was a complete clusterfuck. It wasn't until mid-season 1 that the devs rightfully decided to remove hero stacking, and many would agree that that was the right call. For seasons, ranked was fun. We could experiment running different comps, maybe 2 tanks, 2 DPS, 2 heals, otherwise known as 2-2-2 or standard. People were also running 1-3-2 if they were attacking and wanted an edge. Some supports playing attack side would even start the match as Widowmaker, to try to get a quick pick right as the round started, before returning back to their main healer role. It was a beautiful mix of creativity and skill expression, where players found a multitude of ways to provide impact to their teams. Until one fateful day. It was one fateful day in 2018 when everything changed. The Overwatch meta, once a vibrant tapestry of DPS duels, precision snipes, and high-octane plays, was about to be turned on its head. A small, unassuming team named Goats emerged from the shadows of the North American Open Division, wielding a strategy so unorthodox, so unrelenting, that it would shake the foundations of competitive Overwatch forever. The Goats composition, 3 tanks, 3 supports, was not just a team comp, it was a statement. Reinhardt, Zarya, and D.Va marched forward like an unstoppable war machine, shielded by the relentless healing of Brigitte, Lucio, and Zenyatta. This was no ordinary strategy. It was a juggernaut, a tidal wave of health bars and armor that crushed everything in its path. Opponents watched in horror as their carefully aimed headshots and perfectly timed ultimates were rendered useless against the sheer bulk of Goats. But with great power came great frustration. The Goats meta was relentless. You could even call it oppressive, even boring. Spectators longed for the days of flashy plays and high-risk duels. Instead, they retreated to endless brawls of Reinhardt hammers and Brigitte flails. The Overwatch community cried out for change, and Blizzard listened. Surprisingly. And here we start with the beginning of the end. Or at least, how I think it started. Now, while I agree that Goats comp was an unnecessarily oppressive comp, the developers struck back in the worst way possible. Instead of balancing the heroes so that the comp wouldn't be completely overpowered, the devs decided to introduce role queue. Once a staple part of the game, the freedom to pick out what kind of comp you wanted was gone. Now, you were locked into the rigid structure of 2-2-2. 2 tanks, 2 DPS, and 2 supports. At first, casual players rejoiced. Yay, we finally won't get 6 DPS in one game anymore. And yes, I'll admit, that was a problem in the casual scene of Overwatch. But for higher brackets, the introduction of role queue was a death knell for creativity. The flexibility that was once there to experiment with your unique team compositions, whether it was triple tank, quad DPS, or even the occasional wildcard pick, was gone. Players were now shackled to an unchanging 2-2-2 meta. Their ability to adapt and innovate was stifled by the developers. This hit flex players extremely hard. Role queue didn't just lock players into roles, it locked the game into a predictable, repetitive cycle. The higher ranks, where players thrived on strategy and adaptability, were hit the hardest. No longer could a team pivot mid-match to counter an enemy strategy with an unexpected comp. No longer could a player flex their skills across multiple roles to carry a struggling team. Overwatch, once a game of endless possibilities, have become rigid and formulaic. And then came the queues. Oh, the queues. DPS players, who made up the majority of the player base, now faced wait times of 10, 15, even 20 minutes just to get into a game. Tank and support players, while enjoying shorter queues, were often thrust into matches where they felt like second-class citizens, forced to play roles they didn't enjoy just to keep the game moving. The community began to fracture. As if role queue wasn't enough, Overwatch began to suffer from a content drought. New heroes, maps, and game modes, once regular additions to the game, slowed to a trickle. The developers shifted their focus to Overwatch 2, leaving the original game to languish in neglect. Players grew restless. The excitement of discovering new strategies and mastering new heroes was replaced by monotony. And that's not even talking about the competitive scene. Once a thriving ecosystem of innovation and excitement began to stagnate, the Overwatch League, despite its massive investments and flashy productions, struggled to maintain viewership. The lack of meaningful updates to the game made it harder for fans to stay engaged. The spark that had once made Overwatch special was fading, and there was nothing we players could have done about it. And we're not even started talking about its competitors. While Overwatch was busy shooting itself in the foot, other games were rising to take its place. Valorant, with its tight gunplay and tactical depth, began to lure away FPS fans. Another game was Apex Legends, who offered a fresh take on the hero shooter genre, with fast-paced gameplay and regular updates. Even older games like League of Legends and CSGO continued to thrive, their developers constantly innovating and listening to their communities. Overwatch, meanwhile, felt like a relic of the past. The game that had once defined the hero shooter genre was now struggling to keep up with its competitors who weren't even in the same FPS genre. And last but not least, the final blow. Overwatch 2. Overwatch 2, the supposed savior of the franchise. It promised to be the revolutionary sequel, but instead it felt like a glorified update. The PvE mode, once touted as the game's centerpiece, was delayed, eventually scaled back, and even cancelled entirely. Alongside that, the shift to 5v5, while intending to shake up the meta, only further alienated longtime players. The removal of a tank slot disrupted team dynamics and left many feeling like the game had lost its identity. Imagine if you're an off-tank player for a professional team, and your game decided to cut you out from your team entirely. How would you have felt as your off-tank? Worst of all, Overwatch 2's launch was marred by controversy. The decision to make the game free to play while locking heroes behind a battle pass was seen as a betrayal of the original game's ethos. The monetization felt predatory, and the community backlash was swift and brutal. Today, I'm sad to say that Overwatch is a shadow of its former self. The game that once brought millions together, inspired countless fan art, cosplays, and even an entire esports league, is now a cautionary tale. Its decline wasn't caused by one single misstep, but by a series of poor decisions that eroded the trust and passion of its player base. Yet, despite it all, Overwatch's legacy endures. For a brief, shining moment, it was the most innovative, exciting, and beloved game in the world. And for those of us who were there at the beginning, who experienced the magic of that first team kill, that first overtime victory, that first perfectly executed ult combo, Overwatch will always hold a special place in our hearts. But as the sun sets on this once great game, we can't help but wonder what could have been. On a side note, since Marvel Rivals has come out, it seems like it's finally given Blizzard a reason to start caring again, which, I'm not gonna lie, by itself feels really shit. And I hate that it took almost a decade and a competitor to start finally listening to their player base. A player base who still feels the cuts from the past. A player base that might never trust Blizzard the same way ever again.